Did Ryan Mountcastle just become a little more tradable? Let's talk arbitration coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Monday, January 12th, 2026, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to talk about the arbitration filing deadline that happened late last week with the Orioles not coming to agreements with Kyle Bradish and Keegan Aiken, what it means for the two of them, and the Orioles adding a club option for 2027 onto Ryan Mountcastle, and why that might actually make it more likely that he is moved rather than less. Plus, we'll talk about some interesting talk Gunnar Henderson had about an injury he suffered last year and a trade of, what could have been from the 2017 Orioles. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. The wild card round is here, and FanDuel is officially in playoff mode. So visit FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL, and grab your profit boost pack every NFL playoff game day. So we got a news and notes episode coming up here on a Monday to recap some of the Orioles things we learned since I last recorded on Thursday. And we will start with the arbitration filing deadline, which happened at the end of the day on Thursday. Of course, I did not have a Friday episode, so we get to it here on Monday. The ARB filing deadline is a day where we get probably the biggest ratio of number of posts on social media from baseball reporters versus how much those posts should actually matter to not just the average fan, but really any fan out there looking at their team. Like, you might see Jon Heyman tweet 75 times on ARB deadline day, and maybe one of those has any impact at all on anything. So first, let's talk about what were all these numbers getting thrown around on Thursday, and what does this day actually mean? So again, is the arbitration filing deadline. The arbitration process is how basically baseball players are paid before they hit free agency for the first time. So whether you are drafted or signed as an international free agent, you generally have about 6 years to stay in a minor league system before you become a minor league free agent. And then once you get promoted, you have another 6 years with that major league organization generally before you are eligible to become a major league free agent. So your average run-of-the-mill player could be with a team for 10 years, maybe even more, before he becomes a free agent. But the arbitration process happens generally in years 4, 5, and 6 that players are in the big leagues. This is generally because depending on your exact time on the roster, your exact, when you got called up during the season, you could potentially get a 7th year, or you could potentially only have 5 years. But generally, this is how it works out. In years 1, 2, and 3, guys are mostly making around the rookie league minimum. Some of the best players like Gunnar Henderson will get some pre-ARB bonuses that were worked into the last CBA, but usually you're making less than $1 million a year, somewhere around the league minimum. Then when you enter year 4, you still don't get paid market value, but you start getting paid a little bit closer to what you're actually worth compared to the players around the league, and you hit arbitration for the first time. In years 4, 5, and 6 in the big leagues, the amount of money you make each year is based on your performance in the previous season and a comparison to other players at your position who have had a similar performance level and what they are making or what they've previously made in arbitration. Then after that 6th year, you hit free agency. The numbers can never go down year after year. They can only stay the same if you're like really bad, or go up, even if it's just up incrementally year after year. And then after that 6th year, you become a free agent. Now, the first part of this process is back in November at the non-tender deadline. This is something we talked about back when it happened. At the non-tender deadline, you're taking a look at every player on your roster who is arbitration eligible. So anybody essentially who is between going into years 4 and 6 of their time at the major league level. Those are all the guys who are going to hit arbitration either for the first time, second time, or third time sometimes fourth time this offseason. The non-tender deadline gives teams a chance to what they call non-tender a player. That's basically a player who is still in arbitration. They're not set to hit free agency this offseason, but either the player is injured or they performed so poorly in the previous season, the team, doesn't want to pay them what they might be worth in arbitration or just wants to release them altogether. And if you non-tender a player, you essentially release him. He goes into free agency either a year or 2 years or even 3 years earlier than he would have been had he stuck through the entire 6-year process. Now, the Orioles were going to non-tender 2 players. One was going to be Alex Jackson, the catcher, but they found a trade partner for him and sent him to the Twins for infielder Peyton Eales, who might actually help the Orioles in 2026. And the one player they did tender was Albert Suarez. Now, Suarez was set to make, at most about $1 million in 2026 in arbitration, but he had a major shoulder issue this year that kept him out for 5 months. Then he had an elbow injury late in the year. He's going to be 35. He's one of the guys who falls into the injury category of getting non-tendered. And a lot of times when guys do fall in that injury category, the team that non-tenders them will just re-sign them to a minor league deal. It's a cheaper deal. It also doesn't guarantee the player a spot on a 40-man roster. It makes them more flexible roster-wise. That's exactly what the Orioles did. They non-tendered Suarez, and then like a month later, they re-signed him to a minor league contract. He will be in big league spring training with the Orioles, but does not count against the 40-man roster. Now, the guys you don't non-tender are the ones you tender contracts to. So basically anybody who's in between years 4 and 6, they get tendered a contract that basically says, hey, we want you to be playing back on this team next season. The exact amount of money you will make will be determined at a later date. But right now we are essentially guaranteeing you some amount of money and some amount of roster spot. Now, the Thursday deadline doesn't have really anything to do with roster movement or guys getting released. And that's why it's not really that important. Like you'll see, the Orioles did not come to an agreement with Kyle Bradish or Keegan Aiken. That does not mean either of those guys are hitting waivers or hitting free agency. They are still both on the roster and still, unless they are specifically moved, will be playing for the Orioles in 2026. What it means is the two sides, the team and the player and their agent, couldn't agree to a contract number, how much to pay that player in 2026. So really, when you get to this filing deadline, 2 things can happen. Number one is the team and the player come to an agreement. They've been negotiating based on the player's past performance, based on what players at their position make around the league. For example, the Orioles and Adley Rutschman agreed that Rutschman would make $7.25 million in 2026. His play has been down, but they compared it to other catchers. He's still a good defender. That seemed to be kind of a fair number for Adley to make. The second option is the team and the player aren't able to agree to a number, so they go to arbitration. What essentially happens is they don't get to a number they can agree on, so the team submits their final number. The player submits his final number, which is generally going to be higher than what the team's number is, and they can't come to an agreement. And then most of the time, they end up going to an arbitration hearing when a third-party arbitrator, a neutral person, not involved with either team, generally not even involved with Major League Baseball. And a lot of times you hear stories from players. These people don't even know baseball that well, so a lot of the process is kind of explaining to them the stats that are being used. And that arbitrator or arbitrators, I think sometimes it's a group of 3, they hear an argument from the team, they hear an argument from the player and their agent, and they decide essentially which side is right. So the arbitrator can't say, the Orioles are at $2 million, Kyle Bradish is at $4 million, we're going to award Bradish $3 million for next year. They can only decide on one or the other specific number that was filed, and whoever makes a stronger case at the arbitration hearing wins the hearing, and that's what that player makes in 2026. Now, historically, teams try to avoid going to these arbitration hearings. That's why you see the Orioles had 10, 11-ish players in arbitration, and only 2 of them, Aiken and Bradish, were they not able to come to an agreement with. The rest of them, they agreed on a number at some point this offseason. That player knows what he will make in 2026 because this doesn't happen all the time, but sometimes in the past, and this will continue to happen, players have come out of these arbitration hearings, especially if they go in person. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And they come out with a negative experience against their own team because essentially how it works is, and some of the most famous examples of this, honestly, one of the most famous ones was Corbin Burns with the Brewers the year before Milwaukee traded him to the Orioles. Burns essentially went to his hearing and had the Brewers front office in front of a third party, basically breaking down why Corbin Burns, Cy Young winner, is actually bad. No, he's not the ace of our staff that leads us to the playoffs. This is why he's actually bad and should make less money than he thinks he should. And he came out kind of upset with that, and it led to at least a little bit of him being traded to Baltimore. Now, every year, 15, 20, 25 plus players around the league go to an arbitration hearing. And maybe one or two of those players each year you hear actually speak out with something negative from the hearing. So most of the time, it's pretty cordial. They're haggling over a little bit of money. It's not the star players, and it ends up being okay. But sometimes it does drive a wedge in between a team and a player. And if this is a player who really helps your team and a player you may want to extend to keep with you to a contract, you generally don't want to drive a wedge in there. And that is the reason why it's just a tiny bit concerning that Kyle Bradish was one of the players the Orioles did not agree with. Bradish's final filing was at $3.55 million, and the Orioles' final filing was at $2.875 million. So they're, about $750,000 away from each other, give or take. Now, that's not a ton of money in the grand scheme of things, especially when David Rubenstein and not John Angelos is your owner. But I would think the Orioles side of the argument is, hey, you made only 6 starts for us last year. You're coming off Tommy John surgery. You barely pitched. You shouldn't make a lot more than you made last year because we didn't really see you on the mound. And the Bradish side is, hey, I was still awesome in those 6 starts. I'm now healthy and ready to go. I should get some sort of small raise heading into next year. Now, for me, it's not really worth it to fight over less than $1 million for the guy who right now I still see as the ace of this Orioles staff as I record here on Sunday, January 11th. Now, the nice part is these arbitration hearings generally take place late January through mid-February. Like sometimes players are already at spring training before their hearing actually happens, kind of depending on how many hearings need to happen across the league. So there is some time. And the funny thing is that although Thursday was the filing deadline, you are still able to come to an agreement with the player as long as it happens before the physical hearing date, maybe that's set for February 1st. It still gives you like 3 weeks plus to come to an agreement, even though there was this weird quote unquote deadline. Now, some teams are totally fine with continuing to negotiate. They know that, hey, we didn't come to an agreement, but we have to submit numbers by this date. So let's just submit our numbers and then we'll keep negotiating. And eventually 2 weeks later, they come to an agreement and they basically cancel the hearing that they had. Some teams like the Orioles, under Mike Elias's front office, have it set in the way they want to do this. They call it file and trial. What that means is, hey, we're going to file this number and we are not going to talk again until we get to that hearing. We're going to let the third party decide, and that's what you will make next year. Now, the Orioles have broken that a couple of times, but only when they're adding a club option or a player option to the deal. So my hope would be with Kyle Bradish is the Orioles are still negotiating because even though, he's not set to be a free agent after next year, maybe they're looking to give him a team option or a player option arbitration amount for next year. You can give club options while players are still in arbitration. You could basically say to Bradish, hey, we want to give you, $2.8 million for next year, but we want to do a team option for $10 million in 2027. Bradish could say, okay, fine, let's do that. And then, hey, if I'm really, really good, I'll maybe make $10 million and maybe that's underpaying me a little bit. Or if I'm really bad, you'll decline the option, but we'll still then have to negotiate just a different number that will be lower. So sometimes the Orioles like to do that with players, especially guys coming off of major injuries like Bradish is. I'm hoping that's the case, or maybe they're even negotiating a long-term extension still with Bradish, which would be even much more exciting, though it seems unlikely a guy coming off TJ with his value pretty low would agree to an extension at this time, but that would be the most exciting part. The most annoying part would be the Orioles are haggling with their ace over less than $1 million. Hopefully, all goes well and there's no animosity between the two sides, and Bradish is willing to do some extension talks because I think he could be a great long-term piece, of course, for the Orioles to have in this rotation. Now, the other thing was Keegan Aiken. Aiken filed at 3.375. The Orioles filed at 2.975. Aiken's a free agent after 2026. There's a chance he doesn't even make this team with how bad he was at times last year. Different situation. Still annoying, but not really as worried about the entire Keegan Aiken situation. Now, I would say the most noteworthy part about this was Ryan Mountcastle. We're going to get to that coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. The wildcard round is here, and FanDuel is officially in playoff mode. Every game day during the NFL playoffs, FanDuel is giving customers even more ways to get in on the action. Because right now, every NFL playoff game day, FanDuel users get a profit boost pack waiting for them inside the app. Each game day, you'll see a pack loaded with multiple profit boosts you can apply to the bets you like the most. Those boosts give you more juice on the bets you already like instead of forcing you to try and bet on something new. So you make your picks, then you apply your profit boosters to go for even bigger payouts while the playoffs get rolling. So visit FanDuel, an official sportsbook of the NFL, and grab your profit boost pack every NFL game day. So to finish up this chat on arbitration filing deadlines, I think the most interesting one we saw was Ryan Mountcastle, who's somewhat been the talk of the town after a really, really disappointing 2025 that had injuries and vast underperformance. You add to the fact that Kobe Mayo seems to be here wanting playing time. And then the big thing was the Orioles signing Pete Alonso to a 5-year, $155 million deal, a right-handed hitting, power hitting first baseman, directly overtaking, it feels like, any regular playing time Ryan Mountcastle would have had. You added to the fact that Mountcastle is set to be a free agent after this season, after 2026. Just felt like there was really no future for Mountcastle and the Orioles. And back at that non-tender deadline, I thought, and a lot of people thought, that he was a pretty obvious non-tender candidate. He was projected to make about $8 million this year in arbitration. It seemed weird to give $8 million to a guy who might not even have a spot on this roster at all. Now, the non-tender deadline was before they signed Alonso, so it makes a little more sense. But even then, I was like, just give it to Mayo, sign another bat, and go on with your day. Then, especially after they got Alonso, and we know they were going hard after Kyle Schwarber as well, it was like, if this was your plan, there was no way you were going to have a lot of playing time for Ryan Mountcastle. Why did you guarantee him another contract? So we got to this point at the filing deadline, and there are some kind of rules you can cut through a little bit that would allow the Orioles to release Ryan Mountcastle like right now, and they would only pay him a fraction of what he might be worth in arbitration. But they didn't even do that. The Orioles and Mountcastle came to an agreement that would pay him $6.787 million for 2026, which I believe is almost exactly what he made last year, but is also about $1 million less than MLB trade rumors had projected Mountcastle to get. What they also did was give him a club option. They tacked on a $7.5 million team option for the 2027 season. So Mountcastle was initially set to become a free agent after 2026. Now, if he does somehow stick with the team the entire year, the Orioles would have an option at the end of the year. They can either pick it up and bring Mountcastle back for 27 for $7.5 million, or they can decline the option and he would just become a free agent anyway, like he was initially set to be. Now, for some, it could say, hey, the Orioles are still believing in Mountcastle, and maybe they could even bring him back for another year in 2027 because that's now on the books. Honestly, what I think this club option is, and Ken Rosenthal wrote about this in his piece in The Athletic on Saturday, this is about giving Ryan Mountcastle just a touch more trade value as the O's presumably try to move one of him or Kobe Mayo to get some value back because they're not all three going to be on the roster now with Pete Alonso here as well. And I've talked about it many times. Mayo clearly has more trade value than Mountcastle. He's younger, he's cheaper, and he had a better offensive season than Mountcastle did in 2025. All those things with a lot more team control are going to lead to a lot more value for Mayo. But it's not impossible you could find someone who would want Ryan Mountcastle as a fairly cheap, less than $7 million bounce back candidate for 2026. And when you add on the club option, it adds a little bit of value because then a team says, okay, this isn't just a rental. If Ryan Mountcastle is good enough to at least return to his solid levels of being a hitter we saw a couple years ago, then we could pick up his option and honestly, $7.5 million in 2027, if he's a productive hitter, would not be that expensive at all. And he could still help us for a second year at pretty cheap, which gives him more value than he previously had. So I think a smart job by the Orioles. I don't see a scenario where Mountcastle is an Oriole in 2027. I honestly don't see a great one where he's an Oriole in 2026, even at this point, but it makes him a little more tradable. And maybe you can find a team that can give you an interesting relief arm to help your bullpen in exchange for maybe 2 fairly cheap years of Ryan Mountcastle. I still think they're going to do everything they can to get something for him, but it is still possible Mountcastle just makes this team as like a platoon bat pinch hitter and Mayo is traded, or even Mayo starts the year in AAA Norfolk. We're still a month away from pitchers and catchers. We're still 2.5 months away from opening day. I still think the O's are going to find a way to move Ryan Mountcastle. So that's kind of arbitration in a nutshell, how it impacted the Orioles. Let's take a look at some historical stuff, some things we learned last week that maybe didn't fully come out at the time, but paint some pictures about the Orioles in 2025 and also all the way back in 2017. So I want to start here quickly with Gunnar Henderson, who went on the Orioles Hot Stove radio show on Thursday night, I believe, and admitted that he had been dealing with a shoulder impingement injury for what he said was, quote, about 3/4 of the 2025 season. Now, Gunnar didn't say which shoulder, left or right. I would assume left, because if he's had an impingement on his throwing shoulder, he's probably going to hit the injured list for it. Remember, he started the year on the IL with that core injury, came back about a week in, and played almost every game for the remainder of the season. So my guess would be it was in the left shoulder, but he did say it impacted his swing, his ability to leverage the ball, hit the ball as hard as he wanted to. And you could see it. Like, he still had a good year, 120 WRC plus, still played good defense, but his slugging percentage dropped from 529 in 2024 to 438 in 2025. It was the 6th largest year-over-year slugging percentage drop of any qualified big league hitter this year. He had the 16th largest drop of any hitter in barrel rate this season. Slugging and hitting barrels is something you do when you can lift the ball with impact. If he's saying a shoulder injury didn't allow him to leverage the ball and lift it with impact, that's kind of playing out in the numbers. His swing tilt was down significantly as well, and you could see it did. Shoulder injury kind of changed his swing a little bit. And we had talked about Gunnar still having a good year, but having a down year. Thought it might be maybe he never fully healed from the oblique injury in spring that bled into the season and just couldn't rotate as well. That happens to hitters a lot when they have those oblique type injuries. But a shoulder injury is something that can really affect hitters as well, and that would make sense. Now, he was still good, and he still played good defense, and you're kind of in an in-between here, right, of a guy playing through an injury. Should you be playing through an injury if you are the star young player for a team that is on track to win 75 games and really be nowhere near the playoffs and is selling at the deadline? It's probably would have been smarter for him to take a couple of weeks off and go on the injury list, especially in August or September when we really knew the Orioles were out of things. But he didn't. He still played well, just not as well as we are used to Gunnar Henderson playing. And now you kind of connect the dots of him talking about it. You can see there was clearly something there bothering him. It is, I don't think Gunnar is to the same level because he was still producing, but it's a professional sports thing. It's a masculinity thing. There's a lot of it coming together. We got to stop praising guys for playing through injuries, especially when they are actively hurting themselves or their team when they're doing it. This is something we saw from Colton Cowser last year. It came out, Andy Kusko reported after the season, and we'll talk about this probably sometime next week on the Colton Cowser season review episode. Remember when Cowser rammed into the wall in the outfield at one point late in the year? He was playing with a partially fractured rib for the remainder of the season and only missed a little bit of time, came back and was still in pain and was just playing. And he was not good, especially at the plate. Dude, you're out of it. You're making the team worse. Just take some time off, especially when you're not going to the playoffs, and just heal yourself and be ready for 2026. I don't understand. This is something Austin Hayes did time and time again with the Orioles. Did Hayes spend some time on the injured list? Of course he did. But there was also plenty of times when Hayes was banged up and hurt, and he tried to play through it. And that was why Hayes was always so good in the first half and honestly so bad in the second half of seasons, because he would have these nagging injuries that he just refused to take 2 weeks off for, and, was probably not telling the training staff how bad it really felt. And then he was terrible down the stretch and he would hurt the team. You're not helping the team by being out there and being hurt. Unless you're Gunnar Henderson, if you're 80% of Gunnar Henderson, you're still great. 80% of Austin Hayes, 70% of Austin Hayes, not really helping the team as much as he thinks. And it's just, if you're injured, just go on the injured list. And I know there's still going to be fans that are going to call him weak or whatever, and they're stupid for that. It's just idiotic commentary. If you're injured, get better, go on the injured list, especially if you're going to actively hurt the team by trying to tough it out for some reason. I don't get it. I don't really think Gunner's in that category. Just made me think about all the guys with their injuries this year and some other guys who have done that in the past. Last thing I wanted to talk about, as I mentioned that Ken Rosenthal article in The Athletic on Saturday, talked a little bit about the Orioles, talked about Ryan Mountcastle's trade value, also chatted about the Orioles and Framber Valdez. The reports continue to be that the Orioles are interested in and talking to Valdez and Ranger Suarez, the top 2 remaining free agent starting pitchers on the market. And Rosenthal had an interesting story back from 2017, because he reported that the Orioles almost had Framber Valdez at the deadline in 2017. Now, we knew this back at that deadline, that the Orioles had some sort of agreement with the Astros at the deadline to send closer Zach Britton to Houston. They were going to get some size group of prospects, but the reporting back then was that one of the pitchers in the deal, the Orioles didn't like the medicals on, and they backed out of the trade. Now, very usual of the Peter Angelos era to just have the craziest medical exams possible that players had to pass, and backed out of many deals in his time as Orioles lead owner because of the medicals. And this was just another one that fell apart. Now, the Astros did go on to win that 2017 World Series without Zach Britton. They did have some other help outside of Britton that we know pretty well about now. But this would have been an interesting deal, because back then we really didn't know who the prospects were going to be coming back for Britton. We just knew that there was a prospect package. One of them had something on the MRI the Orioles didn't like, and there was a pitcher, and the deal fell apart. The pitcher with the MRI problem was actually not Framber Valdez. The issue was for Rogelio Armenteros, a 23-year-old right-handed pitcher who had recently had a 1.93 ERA as a starter in Double-A that year, and had just been called up to Triple-A for the first time a couple weeks before the deadline. It was his medicals that were tough. He did eventually get elbow surgery a couple years down the line. He debuted with the Astros, pitched in 5 games in 2019, got hurt, last played in pro ball in 2022, and that's who the deal fell apart for. Now, this deal also reportedly, according to Rosenthal, included J.D. Davis, who was an Astros top 10 prospect at the time, then a 24-year-old infielder who had a 993 OPS in AAA at the time of the trade. He then debuted with Houston right after the deadline, went on to play 9 seasons, really broke out with the Mets, had a 125 OPS plus for 4 years there, 2019 to 22 with the Mets and the Giants. Would have been a good hitter for the O's to have. It also included 21-year-old outfielder Jason Martin, who had an 802 OPS in Double-A at the time. He ended up playing 85 games in the big leagues from 2019 to 2021, and was also included in the Garrett Cole deal when the Astros got him a couple years later. But the final name included in that deal, according to Ken Rosenthal, was going to be then 23-year-old left-handed pitcher Framber Valdez, who had a 2.79 ERA in High A and had just been called up to Double-A for the first time a couple of weeks before the trade deadline. He ended up debuting about a year later, August of 2018 for the Astros. Of course, was a big part of getting Houston back to the World Series in 2019, was a big part of helping them win it in 2022, has been a huge part of their rotation, is now a free agent for the first time. And of course, Rosenthal kind of connecting the dots of, that was Dan Duquette back then, 2017. He was in his second to last year as Orioles GM, but with Mike Elias now in charge, who of course was in Houston with Framber Valdez back at the time of that proposed trade, will he kind of right the wrongs of Orioles past and go and get Framber Valdez? Now, the funny thing is, looking back, is the Orioles didn't end up trading Britton at that deadline. It would have been an interesting time to do it. Now, the O's finished 2017, 75 and 87, and it was kind of the final year of those good Buck runs, but they fell apart in September. They were 51 and 54 at the deadline, so not exactly in it, but they were only 4.5 games out of the final AL wildcard spot with 2 months to go and a talented team with a really good offense. So the Orioles didn't really sell at that deadline. They kind of did a soft buy, but it probably would have been a smart time to trade a closer, right? Britton had a good ERA, but he'd only thrown 20 innings that year. He'd missed 2 months earlier in the season with a forearm strain, but was back pitching well and was healthy. O's just didn't make the deal. And a year later, when the bottom fell out of their season in the final year of Buck Showalter and Dan Duquette, they did trade Britton at the 2018 deadline, along with a bunch of other players they dealt. Britton went to the Yankees for 3 pitching prospects, Cody Carroll, Josh Rogers, and Dylan Tate. Carroll and Rogers both pitched for the Orioles for a little bit because the Orioles team was so bad and they weren't very good, but they got their shot. Tate, of course, stuck and became a good high-leverage reliever for Brandon Hyde and the Orioles for a couple years there. Tate probably ended up being the second most useful player the Orioles got back in their entire haul of the 2018 deadline, only behind Dean Kramer. Like, maybe you could argue that for a stretch there, Bruce Zimmerman more important than Dylan Tate, but it's back and forth. You could argue for him being second behind Kramer that they got back. And although they got 3 guys who played in the big leagues, I think it's pretty clear that had they would have gotten Framber Valdez and JD Davis and 2 guys who at least debuted, would have been a much, much better return than what they actually got for Britton a year later. But does having Framber through the rebuild and the resurgence change things for the Orioles, change things for Framber's development being in Baltimore instead of Houston? Maybe. But hey, they've got a chance to right the wrongs. If they feel like Framber's the guy and the price is right, maybe he'll sign a free agent deal for 4 or 5 years with the Orioles this offseason. And finally, 8.5 years later, he will be in Baltimore. That'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Thank you so much for getting me over 10,000 subscribers. As you know, we had a giveaway on the show last week to celebrate that. The winners, we're going to have 3 of them of the giveaway, will be announced at the end of Wednesday's show. So make sure to be back here on Wednesday's show, which is scheduled to be the next episode this week. That is where I will announce the winners. If you are an audio listener, appreciate you so much as well. Make sure to subscribe to the show, follow the show wherever you listen, leave a 5-star rating and a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you want to reach out to me, talk some ball, ask some questions, mailbag, whatever it may be, you can always email me lockedonorioles@gmail.com. And remember, we still got the Everydayer Club. If you never miss an episode, the Everydayer Club is built for you. Get Locked On Orioles ad-free with members-only Discord access and more. Just head to lockedonorioles.supercast.com to join the club, and there'll be some more information in the show notes as well. I'll be back Wednesday. We're talking about lefty relievers Dietrich Enns and Grant Wolfram, recapping their seasons and giving away those bobbleheads and whatnot to the winners announced Wednesday. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.